It weighed 30 pounds, yet it was no larger than a man's fist. It was forged from a tarnished silver that shouldn't exist in this valley, etched with runes that seemed to crawl across the metal whenever Remington Sherman looked away. Most shepherds walk the low valley for decades without noticing the strange circles where grass refuses to grow. But Remington had just unearthed the one thing the earth was trying to keep silent. He didn't know it yet, but he was holding a resonance prison, a suicide note written in a frequency that would soon delete his own identity. Why would a single note from this bell make a grown man weep for strangers he never knew? And why did an entire civilization choose to vanish rather than let this sound be heard? Geography is a silent witness to the things humans cannot bear to remember. In the low valley, the earth curves into a perfect bowl, a geological fluke that traps sound in its basin, creating acoustic shadows where birds refuse to sing. It is a place of heavy air and stagnant light. Remington Sherman knew the rhythms of this land better than most. For 20 years, he had moved his flocks through the thermal vents, following the warmth of the subterranean fires. But one Tuesday, the routine broke. Near a cluster of obsidian shards, he found the soil disturbed by no animal track. It looked as if the earth had exhaled, pushing a strange glint toward the surface. When Remington reached down, he expected the light weight of a discarded tin or a scrap of farm machinery. Instead, his fingers closed around something that felt wrong for its size. It was a bell, barely larger than a man's fist, yet it felt like it weighed 30 pounds rather than 3. The silver was so tarnished it looked like stone, yet it hummed with a low-frequency vibration that rattled the bones of his hand. As he wiped away the volcanic ash, he saw runes etched into the surface. They were strange, shifting things that seemed to move when viewed peripherally, dancing away from his direct gaze. No geological survey had ever mentioned silver deposits in these latitudes, and no archaeological record spoke of a civilization inhabiting this desolate bowl. The metal was unnaturally cold, resisting the ambient warmth of the volcanic vents. It felt monolithic, a relic that didn't belong to the timeline of the valley. Remington turned it over, noticing the clapper was sealed by a substance that looked like corrosion, but felt like glass. It was as if the bell had been intentionally silenced, locked away by a culture that possessed a mastery over impossible metals. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to keep it hidden, to tuck it into his coat and walk away from the vents. He was a simple man, a shepherd who understood the language of the wind and the needs of his sheep. Yet the bell was speaking a different language entirely. It was the language of a legacy in ruin. The weight of the past was suddenly in his pocket. He looked around the valley, seeing the way the mist clung to the ground in unnatural patterns, as if the air itself was trying to form the shapes of buildings that were no longer there. The silence of the low valley had always been a comfort to him, a reprieve from the noise of the world beyond the ridges. Now, that silence felt predatory. It felt like a void waiting to be filled by the very object he held. He realized that the ground beneath his feet wasn't just dirt and stone. It was a graveyard of memories that had been suppressed for 800 years. He began to notice other anomalies. The circles of dead grass weren't random. They formed concentric rings around the spot where the bell had emerged. It was a blueprint of sound, a map of where the acoustic energy had once been most intense. Remington felt a tether forming between himself and the object. He couldn't leave it here. To understand the present ruin, he had to look at the shadows of the past, even if those shadows were cast by a light he didn't recognize. He began the long trek back to his cabin, the bell growing heavier with every step, the silver lines of the runes beginning to glow with a faint, sepulchral light. He wondered who had forged such a thing. Was it a gift or a curse? In the history of the world, objects are usually created to be used, to be heard, and to be celebrated. But this bell felt like it had been designed for the opposite purpose. It was a vessel for something that needed to be contained. The air around him seemed to thicken with memory as he walked, the phantom scent of gardens and the distant echo of a song he couldn't quite hear. He was no longer just a shepherd. He had become the accidental keeper of a provenance that was never meant to be unearthed. The valley watched him go, the birds remaining silent, the mist closing over his tracks as if he had never been there at all. He reached his door, the metal now vibrating so intensely it made his teeth ache, a silent scream trapped in silver. Inside the cramped confines of his cabin, the shepherd set the object upon a heavy oak table. The wood groaned, protesting a vibration that seemed to make the air itself heavy. Remington Sherman stood over it, his breath hitching in the dim light of a single kerosene lamp. The silence of the room felt brittle, like thin ice waiting for the first heavy step. He reached for a small iron file, intending to prying away the glass-like corrosion that bound the clapper. As the metal tool touched the silver rim, a spark of pale blue light jumped to his fingertips. He didn't flinch. Instead, he felt a magnetic pull, a directive from the artifact itself. With a sharp, sudden snap, the seal broke. The clapper hung free, swaying with a rhythmic grace that seemed to ignore the stillness of the air. Remington took a steadying breath and rang the bell once. The sound was not what he expected. There was no bright metallic chime, no celebratory ring of silver against silver. Instead, the cabin was swallowed by a sub-bass frequency so profound it seemed to bypass his ears entirely, vibrating directly into his sternum and the marrow of his bones. It was a sound that carried the weight of 1,000 years, a low, thrumming pulse that made the very shadows in the corners of the room ripple like water. Then, the tears began. They did not come from a place of personal sadness or a memory of his own grief. They were sudden, hot, and torrential, streaming down his weathered cheeks before he could even register a thought. He wasn't sobbing. His chest was perfectly still, yet he was weeping with a ferocity that felt like drowning. With the sound came the flood. It wasn't a vision in the traditional sense, but a sensory saturation that replaced his reality. He smelled gardens of crystalline flora, a scent of ozone and crushed mint that felt sharp enough to cut. He tasted copper and a melody that had no notes, only emotions. Most jarringly, he felt the phantom sensation of a hand pressing against his own, a mother's hand, soft and smelling of sun-warmed stone. It wasn't his mother. He knew this with a terrifying certainty. He was experiencing the intimate, private textures of a life that had ended 8 centuries before he was born. He saw faces, hundreds of them, flickering behind his eyelids like heat lightning. They were beautiful, their skin shimmering with the same silver luster as the bell, their eyes wide with a collective peace that felt monolithic. The tone lasted for perhaps 10 seconds, but the silence that followed was far more deafening. It was a void so complete that Remington could hear the frantic rhythm of his own heart, which had fallen into a dangerous, skipping arrhythmia. His body was reacting to the sensory overload, as if it were a physical toxin. He collapsed into his chair, his hands shaking so violently he nearly knocked the bell to the floor. He wanted to throw it into the fire, to rid himself of the alien grief that now sat in his chest like a lead weight. Yet, even as his mind screamed in protest, his fingers twitched toward the silver rim. The grief was agonizing, but it was also the most profound connection he had ever felt. He realized the valley hadn't just been hiding an object, it had been holding a scream. Why did he cry for people whose names he didn't know, whose memories were currently rewriting the neural pathways of his brain? The compulsion to ring it again began to itch under his skin, a siren song that promised a truth far more dangerous than the sorrow it required as payment. The morning light offered no comfort, only a stark clarity that made the cabin feel like a stranger's house. Remington Sherman did not return to his flocks. The sheep would wander, guided by instinct and the border collies, but he was tethered to a different master now. He gathered a heavy canvas pack, a rock hammer and a brush, returning to the low valley with the mechanical precision of a man possessed. He didn't head for the thermal vents this time. He followed the silent zones, the patches of heavy air where sound seemed to die. He was looking for the origin of the bell, the physical anchor for the grief that still sat heavy in his lungs. Near the center of the largest dead grass circle, he began to dig, not with the hope of a treasure hunter, but with the grim resolve of an excavator uncovering a grave. 3 feet down, the shovel struck something that didn't ring like stone. It was a cradle, a perfectly carved cavity in a monolithic slab of obsidian that predates the valley's last volcanic eruption by millennia. The cradle was lined with a substance that looked like mercury but remained solid to the touch, a dampening material designed to hold the bell in a state of perpetual energetic stasis. As he cleared the ash, he found secondary artifacts, small, jagged fragments of a resonant crystal that hummed in sympathy with his own heartbeat. When he tapped one with his hammer, it didn't shatter. Instead, it sang a single, pure note that carried the same frequency as the bell, a recorded fragment of a larger, unseen architectural symphony. He spent days mapping the site, his shepherd's mind adapting to the complex geometry of the runes. The runes on the bell began to make sense when viewed alongside the layout of the buried foundations. This wasn't a village or a fortress. It was an exercise in acoustic architecture. The buildings had been designed to amplify or suppress specific emotional states through the manipulation of sound. The runes described a border marker, a silent sentinel placed at the edge of a territory defined not by walls, but by a specific frequency. It was a warning to travelers. Beyond this point, your thoughts are no longer your own. Remington realized with a jolt of terror that the Akathi hadn't been conquered by an outside force. They had been victims of their own atmosphere, a civilization that had turned the very air into a medium for collective memory. His transformation was no longer internal. It was becoming visible. He stopped eating, his body sustained by a nervous energy that felt like a low-voltage current running through his veins. When he closed his eyes, he no longer saw the familiar hills of his youth or the faces of the men he had traded wool with for 20 years. Instead, he saw the crystal gardens of the vision with a terrifying, high-definition clarity. He could remember the exact refractive index of the Akathi sunlight, the way the light split into 7 distinct shades of violet against the glass towers. But when he tried to remember his own mother's name, there was only a static-filled void. His personal history was being overwritten, his synapses being hijacked by the archival data stored within the silver. He was losing himself, the sediment of a life left behind becoming his only reality. He found himself wandering the valley at night, his feet finding paths that didn't exist on any map, but were etched into the neural blueprint the bell had gifted him. He wasn't looking for sheep. He was looking for the entrance to the deeper archives. He knew they were there, buried beneath the valley floor, protected by the same acoustic dampening fields that kept the birds away. The stakes had shifted from curiosity to survival. If he didn't find the source of the transmission, he would eventually cease to be Remington Sherman entirely. He would become a hollow vessel, a human shell inhabited by the echoes of a dead world. Driven by a desperate, fading sense of self, he finally found the stone seal that led downward into the dark. The descent into the archives was not a journey through stone, but a passage through petrified sound. The air beneath the valley floor felt pressurized, a heavy, vibrating medium that tasted of ancient dust and static electricity. Remington Sherman carried the bell in his left hand, its weight now so familiar it felt like an extension of his own skeleton. He reached a central chamber where the walls were composed of the same resonant crystal he had found in the soil above. Here, the silence was aggressive. It pushed against his eardrums with a physical force, demanding to be broken. Remington knew he could not proceed as a mere observer. To navigate this subterranean labyrinth, he had to synchronize his mind with the frequency of the architects. He raised the silver bell, bracing his feet against the obsidian floor, and struck the rim with a deliberate, haunting force. The second ring did not produce grief. It produced light. A blinding prismatic explosion of color erupted from the crystal walls, turning the darkness into a panoramic window. Remington was no longer standing in a cave. He was standing in the heart of the city of the Akathi. The geometry was impossible, a sprawling metropolis of translucent towers that spiraled toward a sky of permanent, iridescent twilight. There were no roads, only bridges of woven light that pulsed in time with a central harmonic rhythm. The architecture didn't just house the people, it sang to them. He watched as the Akathi moved through their daily lives with a fluid, choreographed grace. They were a civilization of perfect recall, their very environment serving as an external hard drive for their collective experiences. In the markets, goods were not exchanged for currency, but for harmonic resonance. A merchant would offer a basket of shimmering fruit, and the buyer would respond with a specific chord, a vocal signature that verified their identity and their contribution to the collective. Children did not learn to read, they learned to sing, their education consisting of absorbing the ancestral voices stored within the living walls of their nurseries. It was a world without secrets, a society where every thought was a shared vibration. Remington felt the sheer beauty of it, the absolute lack of loneliness, the warmth of a billion minds connected in a single symphonic web of existence. He saw the crystal gardens again, but this time he understood their purpose. They were biological resonators, plants that grew in response to the emotional health of the city. Then, the vision curdled. The symphonic beauty was interrupted by a sharp, discordant glitch. The light shifted from violet to a sickly, pulsating grey. Remington saw the faces of the Akathi change. The collective peace was replaced by a frantic, wide-eyed terror. The music of the city became a cacophony of overlapping screams, a viral frequency that was tearing through the connection. People were clawing at their ears, trying to block out a melody that was no longer an exchange, but a consumption. The impossible geometry of the towers began to fracture, the crystal turning opaque and brittle. The transition was so violent that Remington's physical body began to fail. A thick trail of blood leaked from his nose, staining his shirt, and his vision blurred into a smear of static. He was thrown back into the darkness of the archive, his body hitting the obsidian floor with a bone-jarring thud. He lay there for 3 hours in a state of near catatonia, his mind unable to process the scale of the extinction he had just witnessed. When he finally managed to stand, he realized the cost of the immersion. He tried to remember his own name, but the syllables dissolved into static. In its place was only the memory of the Akathi markets. He was becoming a ghost in his own life. Deep within the subterranean silence, Remington stumbled upon a chamber that felt less like a tomb and more like a laboratory for the soul. The walls here were not of raw obsidian, but were lined with shelves of a dark, fossilized wood that should have turned to dust centuries ago. On these shelves sat the remains of a life dedicated to a mystery that Remington was only now beginning to touch. He found the journals of Dr. Finlay Nolan, a name that carried a weight of scholarly obsession. The paper was cool to the touch, possessing a strange, oily texture that resisted the decay of the damp earth. As Remington opened the first volume, the ink began to move. It was a fluid, living script that shifted and reconfigured itself, translating the ancient thoughts into a language Remington could understand, guided by the very intent of his curiosity. The journals were a roadmap through a nightmare. Dr. Nolan had arrived in the Low Valley decades earlier, driven by the same acoustic anomalies that had led Remington to the bell. His notes described a civilization that had reached the pinnacle of harmony, but in doing so, had invited their own destruction. Through Nolan's meticulous translations, the true nature of the silver object became clear. It was not merely a musical instrument or a ritualistic relic. It was a resonance prison. The Akathi had created it in their final hours to serve as a biological vault, a container for the last uninfected collective consciousness of their people. It was a desperate attempt to bottle the essence of their humanity before the darkness consumed the rest. Nolan's writing grew more frantic as the journals progressed, detailing the Akathi's ultimate crime, the creation of the viral song. It had begun as a breakthrough in empathy, a melody designed to transmit thoughts and emotions directly between minds, bypassing the clumsy limitations of speech. Initially, it was celebrated as the ultimate evolution of their species, a way to ensure that no Akathi would ever truly be alone. But the song had a hidden, predatory nature. It was a self-replicating frequency that began to consume the very individuality it was meant to enhance. It didn't just share thoughts, it merged them, eroding the boundaries between I and we, until the concept of a single person became an impossibility. The viral song was a hive mind that didn't just connect people, it erased them, replacing distinct personalities with a single, devouring entity that hungered for more voices to absorb. The journals described the Great Silence with a chilling, clinical detachment. As the infection spread, the Akathi realized that their connection was their undoing. They faced a choice that no other civilization had ever contemplated, to become a single, mindless consciousness that would eventually spread beyond the valley, or to cease existing entirely. In an act of unanimous, tragic mercy, they chose the latter. They constructed acoustic dampening fields and walked into them, effectively turning off the music of their lives. They chose to be forgotten by history, rather than allow the viral song to escape their borders. The silver bell was the only thing they left behind, a suicide note written in a frequency that held the memory of who they were before the song turned them into a monster. Remington sat on the cold floor, the journal heavy in his lap. He realized that the tears he had shed during the first ring weren't just for the dead. They were a response to the sheer weight of that collective sacrifice. The bell held the purity of their final, uncorrupted moments, but it also held the potential for the infection to begin anew. Every time he rang it, he wasn't just observing history. He was interacting with a dormant virus of the mind. The moral complexity of the situation began to crush him. He was the only person on Earth who knew that an entire world had died to save ours. Yet by holding the bell, he was the very vessel that could undo their sacrifice. He looked at the silver object, now glowing with a dull, hungry light. He understood now that the archives were a warning, and he was the only one left to heed it. The journals of Dr. Finlay Nolan ended in a series of jagged vertical lines, as if the pen had been dragged across the page by a hand no longer under the writer's control. Remington Sherman closed the book, the shifting ink leaving a faint silver residue on his calloused thumbs. He felt the weight of the resonance prison pressing against his thigh through his heavy coat. It was no longer just an artifact. It was a living heart, beating with the frantic pulse of 1 billion silenced souls. The air in the archive chamber had grown warm, thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of a coming storm. He knew he should leave. He should climb back to the surface, bury the bell beneath the volcanic ash, and walk until the low valley was nothing but a dark smudge on the horizon. But the compulsion was a physical ache, a thirst that water could not quench. He stood in the center of the crystalline laboratory, his shadow cast long and distorted by the faint phosphorescence of the walls. He felt the Akathi reaching out from the silver, not as individuals, but as a collective pressure, a silent pleading for their story to be finished. The bell felt hot now, a searing intensity that seemed to be feeding on his very attention. It was a symbiotic relationship he hadn't consented to, yet he could not break the tether. He raised the bell one final time, his arm trembling under a weight that now felt astronomical. He knew this would be the cataclysm, the point of no return where the observer becomes the observed. With a jagged breath that tasted like copper, he swung the clapper with everything he had left. The sound that erupted was not a note, it was a rupture. The third ring shattered the physical reality of the chamber, tearing through the atmospheric dampening fields like a blade through silk. Remington wasn't just seeing a vision, he was being folded into the very fabric of the Akathi's final hours. The viral song was no longer a distant threat in a journal. It was a roaring, sentient tide of white noise that flooded his consciousness. He saw the final days of the city not from the outside, but from within the hive mind itself. He felt the sickening joy of the initial infection, the ecstatic rush of being able to feel every heart in the city beating in unison. It was a drug, a beautiful, lethal surrender of the self. Then came the horror. He felt the moment the song turned. He experienced the individual thoughts of a young architect being slowly dissolved, her childhood memories being eaten away to make room for the collective's hunger. He felt the panic of 1,000 mothers as they realized they could no longer recognize the unique cries of their own children, for every child now sounded like the same singular, vibrating entity. The viral song was a parasite of identity, a frequency that required the deletion of the soul to maintain its own resonance. Remington witnessed the choice, the great silence, from the perspective of those who made it. He felt the agonizing, heroic resolve of 1 billion people who loved their humanity enough to kill it. They walked into the dampening fields, not in defeat, but in a final, defiant act of preservation. The physical cost to Remington was immediate and devastating. His heart, already struggling with the previous rings, stopped entirely for 12 agonizing seconds. The world went black, not with the darkness of the cave, but with the void of non-existence. His lungs seized, the air in the chamber becoming unbreathable as the oxygen seemed to vibrate out of his reach. Fine, silver lines began to map themselves across his skin, tracing the paths of his veins like a circuit board. This was the mechanism of the archive. The bell was not just a recording device, it was a transfer station. It was rewriting his neural pathways, using his living synapses to store the data that was too vast for the silver to hold alone. He was being hollowed out to serve as a biological vessel for a dead world's memory. He saw the viral song attempt to leap from the vision into his own mind, a jagged streak of discordant light that hungered for the fresh terrain of a 21st century consciousness. For a terrifying moment, the shepherd's identity flickered like a dying candle. He forgot the feel of war, the smell of rain on the ridges, the sound of his own name. He was Remington, but he was also the architect, the merchant, and the child. He was the archive of a suicide note. Then, as the frequency reached a crescendo that threatened to liquefy his very bones, the bell's own dampening properties kicked in. The silver blackened instantly, absorbing the excess energy, and the vision collapsed into a singular, crushing point of silence. Remington fell, his body hitting the obsidian floor as the silver lines in his skin began to glow with a permanent, haunting light. The cataclysm was over, but the shepherd was gone. In his place lay something that had begun to remember 10,000 years of history it had never lived. The descent into the archives had been a journey of discovery, but the ascent back to the surface was a funeral procession for a single soul. Remington Sherman emerged from the stone seal into the twilight of the low valley. Yet he did not see the familiar grey mist or the jagged peaks of the ridges. His eyes, now etched with permanent silver flecks, reflected a light that was not present in this world. To look through his eyes was to see two worlds layered atop one another: the barren, volcanic reality of the present and the shimmering, translucent ghost of the Akathi metropolis. The physical transformation was not merely aesthetic, it was a fundamental restructuring of his biology. He moved with a newfound, rhythmic precision, his footsteps no longer the heavy trudge of a mountain shepherd, but the measured glide of a being tuned to a specific, internal frequency. The cost of the archives was a total dissolution of identity. As he walked toward his cabin, Remington found that his own memories were like fading photographs left in the sun, bleached and unrecognizable. He could no longer recall the taste of his favorite meal or the specific sound of the mountain wind through the pines. These personal anchors had been replaced by the collective trauma of a billion strangers. He remembered the first time an Akathi child felt the viral song touch their mind. He remembered the smell of the city's burning libraries. He remembered the collective gasp of a world choosing to die. He began to speak, but the words that left his lips were no longer I. He spoke in the first-person plural, a haunting we that vibrated with the resonance of 1,000 voices. We remember the gardens, he whispered to the empty air, and we remember why they had to burn. The low valley itself seemed to respond to his transformation. The vegetation near his path began to grow in unnatural, geometric patterns, mirroring the crystalline architecture he carried in his mind. The very soil seemed to hum as he passed, the volcanic ash shifting to form the jagged runes of the bell. The mist, once a silent shroud, now whispered in the sibilant, melodic language of the lost civilization. It was as if his presence as a living vessel was leaking the Akathi's reality back into the physical world. The moral stakes had crystallized into a terrifying, binary choice. If Remington chose to stay in this world, he would eventually become the patient zero for a memory infection that could rewrite the planet. If he died, the Akathi and their ultimate sacrifice would vanish into the void of true erasure. He reached his cabin and stood by the door, his hands trembling as he examined them. The skin was translucent, the silver veins beneath the surface pulsing with a rhythmic, pale light. He looked at the calluses on his palms, the honest marks of a life spent tending sheep, and felt a profound, biting grief. He was mourning himself. He was the last witness to the life of Remington Sherman, a man who was being slowly deleted by the very history he had sought to preserve. He realized that the Akathi had not intended for the bell to be found by a single person. It was a burden meant for a collective, yet he was the only soul available to carry the weight. The shepherd's training, the simple wisdom of the hills, and the quiet dignity of his isolation were the only things keeping the viral song from fully claiming his mind. He sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For the first time, he understood the true nature of the resonance prison. It wasn't just the bell, it was the person holding it. He was the cage for 1 billion ghosts. He realized that to save the memory of the Akathi without letting their infection spread, he had to become a permanent hermit of history. He had to stay in the acoustic shadows of the valley, where the sound could be contained. The choice was a slow, living suicide. He would live out his days as a library of ash, a man who knew everything about a dead world and nothing about his own. He looked at the bell, now fused to his hand by a growth of silver-black metal, and accepted the frequency of his new existence. He was no longer a shepherd of sheep. He was the shepherd of a ghost civilization's final, weeping mercy. The time for observation had ended. Remington Sherman felt the atmospheric pressure of the low valley reach a critical threshold, a point where the air itself seemed to turn into a solid, vibrating wall of intent. He stood at the exact coordinates where he had first unearthed the silver artifact, the ground beneath his boots now scorched black and humming with a subterranean power. The bell was no longer silver. It had turned a deep obsidian black, its surface thrumming with the stored lives of 1 billion souls. It felt as if he were holding a dying star in his palm, a concentrated mass of grief, joy, and the ultimate mercy of a civilization that chose to vanish. He could feel the viral song scratching at the inside of his skull, a jagged, discordant melody that promised a beautiful, soul-crushing unity. To keep it contained, he had to finish the transmission. He had to become the final note in their symphony. With a deliberate, terrifying acceptance, Remington raised the blackened bell. He was no longer afraid of the identity he was losing. The shepherd named Remington Sherman was already a ghost, a fading memory eclipsed by the monolithic presence of the Akathi. He understood now that his life was the final payment required to seal the archive forever. He braced his body, his silver-veined skin glowing with a fierce internal light that pushed back the valley mist. He swung the clapper one last time. This was not a ring. It was an invitation. The final frequency did not explode outward, it imploded. Remington was instantly submerged in the entire 10,000-year lifespan of the Akathi, compressed into a single, staggering heartbeat. He experienced the birth of their first crystalline cities, the evolution of their harmonic language, and the quiet, domestic bliss of 1 million forgotten afternoons. He saw their triumphs and their failures, their art and their science, all of it flowing through his neural pathways like a river of liquid light. He was the vessel for their entire history, a living library of a world that had been erased from the maps of time. But within that beauty, he felt the sharp, cold edge of their final choice. The truth of their erasure was not an act of despair, but an act of profound, cosmic mercy. The Akathi had realized that their interconnectedness, while beautiful, had become a weapon. The viral song was a biological inevitability of their evolution, a frequency that would have eventually consumed every conscious mind in the universe. They died so that the concept of the individual could live. Remington felt their collective gratitude as he accepted their burden. He let his own synapses rewrite themselves completely, allowing his childhood memories, his name, and his very sense of self to be sacrificed to provide a stable foundation for their legacy. The tension in the valley reached a breaking point. The ground vibrated at impossible frequencies, the obsidian shards beneath his feet shattering into dust as the acoustic energy peaked. All the voices of the Akathi rose in a final, unified chord, a song of farewell that shook the very foundations of the ridges. The mist turned into a swirling vortex of prismatic light, and for one brief, eternal second, the city of the Akathi was visible in its full, shimmering glory, superimposed over the barren valley. Then, the sound reached a frequency beyond human hearing. A shockwave of absolute silence rippled outward, snuffing out the light and the heat. When the dust settled, the transformation was complete. Remington Sherman did not fall. He stood perfectly still, his eyes wide and reflecting a history that spanned eons. He was no longer the shepherd who had found a silver bell in the dirt. He was the bellkeeper, the archive of ash, the living containment unit for a dead world suicide note. The bell was now permanently fused to the blackened skin of his hand, a part of his very anatomy. He looked down at his fingers, seeing the smooth, aristocratic grace of an Akathi architect where there had once been the rough calluses of a labourer. He remembered the gardens, he remembered the song, and he remembered the silence. He was the only person left to weep for them, not because he was a stranger, but because he was all of them. The shepherd was gone, and in the hollowed-out shell of his life, 1 billion ghosts finally found a place to rest. The aftermath of the final frequency left the low valley in a state of permanent, sepulchral grace. The volcanic vents still hissed, but the steam now carried a melodic quality, a lingering resonance that seemed to hum in the back of the throat. Remington Sherman, or the entity that inhabited his skin, did not return to the cabin. The life of a shepherd, with its seasonal rhythms and simple needs, was a garment that no longer fit. The bell was no longer silver or obsidian. It was a tarnished, matte black, fused to the palm of his right hand by a growth of metallic tissue that looked like ancient scarring. His features had become blurred, his face shifting in the light, as if his bone structure were trying to settle into 1,000 different identities at once. He had become a wanderer of the lowlands, a silent sentinel who carried the weight of 1 billion lives in a single, heavy fist. He travelled the ridges and the shadowed basins, moving with a purpose that ignored the boundaries of maps or property. He was no longer bound by hunger or the need for sleep. He was sustained by the low-frequency vibration of the archive itself. When he encountered a traveller or a stray shepherd, he did not speak. He simply raised the blackened hand and rang the bell once. The sound was no longer a viral threat. It had been filtered through the sacrifice of his own soul. It was a restorative frequency, a tone that allowed those who heard it to remember what was once lost, not the Akathi's memories, but the value of their own fleeting individual lives. He became a living legend, the man who weeps for strangers because he is the stranger. He was the guardian of the great silence, ensuring that the mercy of the Akathi was never forgotten, even if their names remained buried. The geography of the valley changed permanently in his wake. The mist now stored sound, replaying the softest whispers of the wind, as if the air itself had developed a memory. The soil, once barren, began to sprout jagged fragments of crystal that glowed with a faint violet light during the solstice. It was a landscape of memory, a place where the barrier between the past and the present had worn thin. Remington watched over this transition with a detached, pluralistic gaze. He saw the world through the collective eyes of a civilization that had mastered harmony only to find it a prison. He understood that his existence was a compromise, a way to keep the fire of their history burning without allowing the forest of the present to catch fire. He was the archive of ash, a man who had traded his own biography for a library of ghosts. As the decades passed, the legend of the bell-keeper grew. He was seen on the high cliffs during storms, his silver-veined skin acting as a lightning rod for the atmospheric energy. He was the one who stood at the edge of the acoustic shadows, a warning and a witness. The cycle of the valley remained closed, a pocket of preserved time where the sacrifice of the Akathi remained a living truth. He knew that eventually, even his restructured biology would fail. The archive would need a new vessel, a new soul willing to be hollowed out for the sake of a dead world's mercy. He left the bell at the exact center of the obsidian cradle, the metal finally cooling as he felt the last of his personal consciousness begin to dissolve into the collective. The shepherd was finally going home, even if home was a city of light that no longer existed on any map. The bell sits in the volcanic soil of a different valley now, waiting for the next witness to find it. The weight it carries isn't silver. It is the residue of a civilization that chose absence over assimilation. Remington's transformation was the price paid to keep that choice sacred. If you want to hear more forgotten legacies, subscribe and listen for the frequency that answers in tears. What would you sacrifice to remember the truth?